Welcome to the case file. Here, every crime has a story, every mystery leaves a trail, and every detail could be the difference between truth and deception. From assassinations that shook the nation to manhunts that gripped entire cities, we uncover the raw, unfiltered events behind the headlines. These are not just stories. They are lives, choices, and consequences. The files are open, the cases are real, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is the case file. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the next case might be the one that changes everything. This is a true life story. She was there for the first time, a young woman, full of hope, stepping onto an American train, looking for safety in a new country. But within minutes, her journey turned into a nightmare that shocked commuters, the nation, and the world. We are hearing from a survivor who was on board that train the night a refugee from Ukraine was stabbed to death. She says the trauma was so deep, she never wants to ride a train again. As many now ask, what really happened that night? And why didn't anyone step in sooner? The victim was 23-year-old Iryna Zarutska, a Ukrainian refugee who came to the United States to escape war. On that night, she boarded the Lynx Blue Line in Charlotte, North Carolina, still in her work uniform. But her life was about to be stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. Surveillance cameras captured the horrifying scene. At first, fellow passengers didn't realize how badly injured Iryna was. She collapsed onto the floor, almost out of sight, as blood began to pour. Meanwhile, the accused killer, DeCarlo Brown, could be seen stalking the rail car. His knife dripped with blood. His own hand was bleeding from a cut, and he mumbled to himself as terrified passengers scrambled to get out of his path. When Brown finally exited the train, other commuters rushed forward. But for Iryna, the damage was already catastrophic. One passenger, Takara Howard, was seated several rows away. She later recalled her disbelief. "Do you think people should have helped her?" she was asked. Her answer was clear. "I really do think people should have helped her. But I think many didn't know what to do. A lot of them were in shock." The hesitation of the passengers has become one of the most haunting parts of this case. The murder even struck a chord overseas. John Rudat, a male model who once suffered a slashed face while protecting women on a train in Germany, spoke out. He insisted that if he had been there, his first priority would have been Iryna. She was obviously losing blood, he said. Yes, people may have been scared for their own lives, but she needed help, and they let her lie there. While the world struggled with disbelief, DeCarlo Brown's own family confronted him in jail. His sister Tracy asked the question on everyone's mind. Why her? Why a young woman, from Ukraine, of all people? Brown's answer revealed a fractured reality. He suffers from schizophrenia, and claimed that voices in his head controlled him. In his own chilling words, "I don't have nothing. They just lashed out on her. That's what happened." As news spread, Iryna's family broke their silence. In their statement, their heartbreak was clear. Iryna came here to find peace and safety, and instead her life was stolen from her in the most horrific way. No family should ever have to go through this. Iryna's family, still in shock, began to make plans in the aftermath of her murder. They decided she would be buried in the United States, the country where she had hoped to start a new life. For them it was a painful choice. They could have brought her back to Ukraine, but the war made that nearly impossible. And more than that, they felt her story now belonged here, in the very place where it ended. Her relatives described her as a vibrant young woman, with dreams far bigger than the circumstances she had fled. She wanted to study, to master English, and to give back to the community that welcomed her. She had told them she loved America, that despite the struggles of being a refugee, she believed this was where she could build a future. That dream was cut short in just minutes. As her family mourned, the city of Charlotte struggled to process the crime. Vigils were held, candles lit, and flowers placed on train platforms in her memory. Strangers who never knew Iryna gathered to say her name, to remind the world that she was more than just a victim. Her death sparked debates across the country. Was public transit safe? Should there be more security? And what about the mental health system that had failed to keep someone like DeCarlo Brown from becoming a danger? For many, the case became more than just one tragedy. It was a mirror held up to society, showing flaws in safety, in justice, and in compassion. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared their case. Brown faced charges of first-degree murder, and federal authorities added a separate charge, an act of violence causing death on a mass transportation system. That meant he could face life in prison, or even the death penalty, if convicted. But his defense was already taking shape. His lawyers would argue that Brown was schizophrenic, that he was not in control of his mind, and that the voices he heard were to blame. It was the start of what promised to be a long, painful legal battle. For Iryna's family, though, the courtroom couldn't give them what they had lost. No sentence, no justice could bring her back. What they wanted was simple and impossible. Her life, her smile, her future. They said it best in their own words. No family should have to go through this. Iryna's death did not remain just a local tragedy. News outlets across the United States, and even abroad, picked up the story. For many, it was unthinkable. A refugee who had already endured the horrors of war was murdered in a place she believed would protect her. The images from the train, the silent surveillance footage, the chaos, and the passengers frozen in fear spread online. They fueled debates about responsibility. Should bystanders have acted sooner, or were they right to protect themselves first? On social media, arguments raged. Some defended the passengers, saying no one should be expected to confront an armed man. Others insisted that if even one person had stepped in, Iryna might still be alive. The case also entered politics. Leaders pointed to the murder as a symbol of larger issues: the state of mental health care, gaps in public transit security, and the rise of random acts of violence. Some used it to push for tougher crime laws. Others called for more compassion and better treatment for people living with severe mental illness. Suddenly, Iryna's name was being spoken in debates far beyond Charlotte. Her death became a reference point in conversations about safety, justice, and policy. Meanwhile, the focus returned to the man at the center of it all, DeCarlo Brown Jr. He sat in a cell, facing charges that could lock him away for the rest of his life. His defense would hinge on one thing: his mind. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, Brown claimed that voices pushed him to lash out. To some, it was a tragic story of untreated illness. To others, it was no excuse. The courts would have to decide: was this cold-blooded murder, or the act of a man lost to madness? For Iryna's family, none of that mattered. What mattered was the empty chair at the table, the phone calls that would never come again, the plans she once made, to study, to travel, to live, gone forever. Her relatives clung to the memories of her laughter, her dreams, and her determination to build a life after war. They spoke of her as a symbol of hope, someone who refused to give up despite everything she had faced. And now, that hope had been taken. For Iryna's family, the days after her death were a blur of grief and disbelief. They had spoken to her only hours before the attack. She had sounded tired, but happy. Proud that she was working, that she was building something for herself in this new country. Now, instead of hearing her voice, they were forced to identify her body. Instead of making plans for her future, they were making plans for her burial. They wrestled with the hardest decision of all. Should they bring her back to Ukraine, back to the homeland she had loved despite the war? Or should she remain in America, the country where she had pinned her hopes, but also the country where her life had been stolen? In the end, they chose to bury her in the United States. The journey back to Ukraine was nearly impossible, with the war still raging. And more than that, they felt her story, her tragedy, now belonged here. They wanted Americans to remember her name. They wanted her to be seen not only as a victim, but as a young woman who believed in this place, who trusted it enough to call it home. Iryna's relatives described her as energetic, curious, and determined. She had been teaching herself English, often laughing at the mistakes she made, but never giving up. She dreamed of finishing college. She wanted to work in business, maybe even start something of her own one day. Her friends remembered how she loved music, how she danced, how she always found a reason to smile, even in the darkest moments of the war. To them, she was not just another refugee. She was a light, and someone who refused to be defined by tragedy. That is why her murder struck so deeply. Because it was more than violence. It was the silencing of a spirit that had already endured so much. In Charlotte, the shockwaves continued. Vigils were held on the very platforms where she had once walked. Candles flickered in the night, flowers were laid on the ground, and people who had never met her wept openly. For commuters, every ride on the Blue Line now felt different. Passengers looked around nervously, wondering if danger might strike again. Some admitted they avoided the train altogether, too shaken by what had happened. City leaders promised improvements: more officers on trains, more security cameras, more patrols at stations. But for many, those promises felt too late. The question they kept asking was simple: why did it take a death like this to bring change? Meanwhile, in a county jail, DeCarlo Brown Jr. sat alone. He had been arrested within minutes of stepping off the train. His sweatshirt was discarded, his knife stained with blood. When investigators questioned him, his answers were scattered, rambling. He spoke of voices, of control, of being pushed to act by something beyond himself. To police, it was both familiar and frightening. Brown had a long history of mental illness. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He had spent time in and out of treatment. But somewhere along the way, the system had failed, and that failure ended with Iryna's death. His sister Tracy visited him in jail. She demanded to know why. Out of all the people on that train, why had he chosen her? Brown's reply was chilling. I don't have nothing. They just lashed out on her. That's that. That's what happened. To him, it was simple. To everyone else, it was unthinkable. Prosecutors announced they would pursue first-degree murder. They argued this was not random, not just an accident of illness, but a deliberate act. He had carried a knife. He had chosen a victim. He had struck with lethal force. Federal authorities stepped in as well. Because the killing took place on public transit, Brown also faced a federal charge, an act of violence, causing death on a mass transportation system. That meant he could face life in prison, or possibly even the death penalty. His defense, however, would be built around his mind. His lawyers would argue insanity, claiming he was incapable of understanding his actions. The court would soon become a battleground between the horror of what happened and the complexity of mental illness. But for Iryna's family, none of this mattered. No verdict could undo what had been done. No sentence could bring her back. They asked only one question: why her? Why their daughter, their sister, their friend? Why a girl who had survived war, only to die on a train in a place she thought was safe? It is a question that may never have an answer. The case quickly spread into national debate. Commentators on TV, politicians in Washington, and everyday citizens online all had something to say. Some pointed to the passengers, questioning why no one stepped in. Were they cowards, or were they simply human beings facing a nightmare they weren't prepared for? Others turned their focus on the system, on the failure to treat Brown's schizophrenia, on the cracks in mental health care, and on the lack of security in public spaces. And then there were those who saw it as part of a larger story, a symbol of a society where violence feels unpredictable, where safety feels fragile, and where even those who run from war are not safe. As the weeks passed, her name did not fade. People continued to share her story, to post her picture, to demand justice in her memory. Her funeral drew crowds larger than her family could have imagined. Strangers came, carrying flowers, whispering prayers, holding each other as they cried. For many, Iryna's death was not just about loss. It was about responsibility. It forced people to ask hard questions about fear, about courage, about what we owe one another in moments of crisis. Her family, still broken, hoped only that her name would not be forgotten, that her life, and her death, might lead to something better, something safer, for others. Iryna fled bombs and bloodshed in her homeland. She came to America believing it would give her peace. But on a train filled with strangers, she found only silence, fear, and a blade that ended everything. Her story is a reminder that safety is never guaranteed, that systems fail, and that even the strongest dreams can be shattered in a moment. She came seeking life. What she found was death, and a question the world still cannot answer. This has been The Case File. For more real stories that must be told, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because every story matters, and every case leaves behind a truth we cannot ignore.